are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. One of the things that becomes immediately apparent during times of war and conflict is the power of narrative and story to shape our common understanding of the events around us. Narrative stories are kind of the DNA around which societies are organized, and the way they're constructed can change our perception of the world and of world events. In the context of what's going on in the Middle East right now, my next guest is Dr. Maha Hilal. Maha Hilal is the executive director of the Muslim Counterpublics Lab, which can be found at Muslim Counterpublics Lab, all one word, .org. And she's the author of the book Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. She joins us now. So first of all, Maha Hilal, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Richard, for having me.
Let's begin with this. What does, just to kind of set the stage for this, in terms of your book, outline the Muslim experience since 9/11, in terms of, let's start with this actually, what's a counterpublic?
So that's a great question. So the idea of counterpublics comes from Habermas's concept of the public sphere, where, communities and people come together to debate issues, right, that are impacting them, including actions taken by the government. Now, in its initial conception, it was presented as sort of a democratic space where everyone has equal access. Of course, we know that that's not true, right? Because there are many groups that become marginalized and get marginalized in these spaces. So counterpublics are these spaces, right, where groups that are marginalized come together, formulate and have a space of safety to create their own narratives, but also a place in which they can challenge the ideological status quo that is often built into dominant narratives and rhetoric.
So, for example, although we'll be talking about the Middle East and probably about the Muslim experience here as well, people who may not even know the term, I think if they've been following, let's say, the progressive movement for a while, should be familiar with the concept, for example, in the way the national narrative changed after the killing of George Floyd and the arising of the Black Lives Matter movement. As you describe the idea of a counter-public and a narrative shifting, it seems to me that what we saw, many of us, had our own feelings about this and perceptions about it before the George Floyd killing. But I think what we saw on a national level there was a kind of counter discourse that was not the dominant narrative in the country, shifting so that millions of people suddenly awoke to what and millions of non-Black people in particular, to what it meant to be Black in the United States, what it meant to fear for your life from the police or other forces. Would that be an example of narrative shifting?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think, to me, one of the important pieces to emphasize here is, specifically because I work within the Muslim spaces, is when you look at the ideas of counter-narrative, right? Oftentimes, the dominant narrative when it comes to Muslims will say things like Muslims are terrorists, right? Or Muslims are barbaric, or their religion is uncivilized. And oftentimes, the rebuttal or the response from Muslims is, no, we're not terrorists, right? We're good citizens, we pay our taxes, we vote, right? That's not actually a counter-narrative, because the counter-narrative shouldn't dispute the dominant narrative, which in turn sort of reiterates it, right? Instead, it's different, right, to actually create an organic narrative that is not responsive to this narrative that Muslims are terrorists, right? We don't have to answer that question. We don't have to build that into our narrative. And we also can challenge what are the basic assumptions behind those assertions. What is terrorism, right? What is state violence? Why is it constantly weaponized against Muslims? And that, to me, is sort of the difference when we talk about specifically narrative shifting, right? Because narrative shifting is where we're changing the narrative But when we talk about what is actually a counter narrative and what it actually is, this idea of a counter public, it's that we're dismantling these status quo assumptions that have been imposed upon marginalized groups.
So, in other words, the goal is not to rebut the dominant narrative, but to transcend it or bypass it, create a more accurate narrative. And when you talked about state violence and terrorism and so on, what came to mind is the only quote I like from a person I consider largely despicable, and that's Pat Buchanan. And if you remember Pat Buchanan, the conservative commentator, who said once, and I don't know if this relates to what you're saying or not, but Buchanan did say once that war is the terrorism of the rich, and terrorism is the war of the poor. So, and sometimes to me, it seems that narrative gets retroactively rewritten, right? For example, you had the Irgun in Palestine, in British Mandate Palestine, which bombed, among other things, the King David Hotel, killing some civilians. By any modern definition, a terrorist group. But 30 years later, or maybe less, 25 years later, a leader of that group, Menachem Begin, was the prime minister of Israel, and retroactively it was determined they were not terrorists. So it seems to me this is a kind of a fluid line that may be used for other purposes other than deploring terrorism. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a term that's consistently weaponized, right? Especially against groups that are being oppressed. And it also negates the violence that is imposed on the marginalized communities, right? And puts this label of terrorism to basically erase the possibility that they have any legitimate resistance, that they can resist legitimately. And that's not something that the state can accept, right? So instead of the state retracting, right, and reversing its oppression, instead it calls this resistance, or it calls any sort of challenge to state violence, terrorism, and then that enables it to respond with what it then calls counterterrorism.
And what strikes me about this, again, is the selectivity of the usage of it. The Boston Tea Party in American colonial history was terrorism. It was vandalism. It was non-state violence, in this case against property, but it was violence none the same. The French resistance could be deemed terrorism. These young people, White Rose, I think they were called, who assassinated Nazi occupiers, you could call that terrorism too. So it seems to me the fact that we don't, and by the way, of course, I'm condemning none of those actions when I describe it, but they fit the category. And so to me, it does suggest an ideological dimension, and it suggests, even though it doesn't explicitly say it, it suggests a greater level of collective guilt to me, because it seems to me that when we say a government is doing something monstrous through its army or its state force, we don't hold its citizens as responsible as if we say, quote unquote, those people, whether it's an entire religion, whether it's an entire region, whether it's a people like the Palestinians, it seems that when you use terrorism, it's much easier for people to lapse into the concept of collective guilt, and as if it's a cultural or social or religious reflection of what the people sharing the demographics of the people committing the violence are. Does any of that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I don't want to take up space that, otherwise should be taken by Palestinian voices. But if you look at what's happening now, I mean, sure, the dominant narrative and the media and the Israeli government and the US government refer to Hamas as a terrorist organization without understanding, right? First of all, that Israel has enabled Hamas. Second of all, that Hamas has been very clear about its objective, which is not actually right about eliminating Israel, and it's about resistance, it's about Palestinian liberation. But that aside, I find it extremely hard to believe that because of the way Israel operates, that it would accept any form of government from the Palestinians, even if they had a, quote, democratically elected government that people agreed to was actually democratically elected, right? Even if there was consensus, I mean, we can go into that on different levels, right? Because of the lack of recognition about what Palestinians are resisting, they're always going to be called terrorists, because the point of calling someone a terrorist is to negate their experiences of oppression and to absolve the state of responsibility, so that when it's responding to people that are called terrorists, they don't actually have to look at root causes. They don't actually have to examine and investigate why people would respond to the state through violence. And that is the express purpose, to absolve, again, the state from responsibility. And that's why, we can look at, for example, when Hamas attacked Israelis, right? Attacked Israel, it was referred to as unprovoked, right?
Right.
Obviously, that comes from the idea that we are not going to recognize any of the violence that happened that preceded these attacks. And of course, that's a deliberate rhetorical tactic, right? To erase what Israel has been doing. And the last thing I'll say about this is, when we think about narrative, one of the ways in which these wartime narratives are used, and which they have been used, if you look at Bush's speeches, for example, in the onset of the war on terror, is that there's a specific manipulation of time. Bush is often would say in his speeches, this is where we need to make history, right? History will be made through our actions. And it was as if, again, nothing preceded the 9/11 attacks. There was literally no explanation for why anyone would dare to attack the United States, except for these manufactured ideas of, they're just jealous of our freedom and our democracy, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, absolutely. I agree with that 100%, Maha. And I had a couple thoughts about that. One is, and I've noticed this both in my writing, response to my writing, and in personal conversations, there's not only pushback when any of us, I think, attempt to introduce historical context into any of this. There is, in my experience, there's sometimes rage. There is a fury that comes back as if somehow to provide context is to excuse the worst forms of violence, and that the only proper response is to mourn one group and not another. And if you try to mourn both, that's both sidesism. If you try to give historical context, that's excuse making. And but what it becomes is a kind of collective psychosis, because if you knew an individual who couldn't remember what happened yesterday and has no understanding of what will happen tomorrow based on what they're doing today, you would say they're cognitively disabled. And yet, as a society, that sometimes appears to be the insistence, and there's actual rage. Again, as I say, in my experience anyway, when you challenge that. And I wonder if that isn't the kind of cognitive dissonance of people not wanting their worldview challenged. Since you work in this world of competing narratives, I was wondering if you had any insight on that.
Yes. So I guess, we're dealing right with Israeli genocide against the Palestinians right now. And obviously the narratives that Israel and the United States have used have served to justify and sanction this genocide. And, I've been in numerous spaces now in which this is being discussed. And when you say that Israel is committing a genocide, all of a sudden, the response is, well, Hamas attacked children and families, right? As if that negates the fact that Israel is committing genocide. Both things can be true, right? That Israel is committing genocide and Hamas attacked children and families. At the same time, we then have to look closer at that narrative. Because when you say, and when people continuously say, Hamas killed children and families, that implies that Israel doesn't also kill children and families. And that's another problem with the narrative. People are unwilling to apply the same language. If you want people to condemn what one side is doing, then you have to be objective and look at what the other side is doing. And, I was in a conversation in which someone said Hamas kills children and families. And then they said, I will condemn any country, including the United States, that kills civilians. In that statement, it was very intentionally absolving Israel. The person couldn't even say Israel is killing civilians. And then if we actually replaced Israel with the United States, it went from children and families to civilians. And that is a specific, deliberate way of dehumanizing Palestinians. And so there are a lot of ways. It's not just the choice of the words that you're using, the rhetoric and the narrative. It's the ways in which there's power that's applied to, right? And the ways in which groups are consistently negated. And people can't hold multiple truths, right? At this point in time, even though, Hamas attacked Israelis, right? We don't endorse attacks of civilians ever, right? And I shouldn't even have to say that, but because when I say that, obviously the implication is I need to because I'm Muslim, right? But we should be able to say that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians because that is what's happening. And we should be able to recognize that Hamas is not a state. Hamas simply cannot inflict as much violence and damage on Israel as Israel is doing now. And it's absurd that that has to be repeated. And it's absurd that the violence of the state, a massive apparatus, is being negated in terms of who is going to inflict more violence.
First of all, I want to say in response, Maha, that in terms of, I wanted to reassure you that we are going to hear the Palestinian voice in this episode of the program. It took some doing, but because, of course, there's been no electricity in Gaza for some time now. But Ahmed Abu Artama, who was one of the founders of the Nonviolent March of Return, where thousands of people were shot by the Israeli military protesting nonviolently at the fence, he is in Gaza. But since there's no power, what I've had to do is I had to use, when he could get power on his phone, I sent him questions and he would voice record the answers back by WhatsApp and currently splicing them all together to broadcast them. But that's what it takes right now to get word from Gaza, given the situation there. But another piece of the narrative that I think has been weaponized has been the violence against the Baptist hospital in Gaza City. We still don't know, hundreds of deaths. We still don't know the exact number. And the question about whether it was just bombed by Israeli forces or, as Israel and the U.S. claims, by an errant rocket from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which, I mean, the name could have been chosen for, to send a message. I should be fair before I ask my question and point out that we don't know the answer yet, but there have been some very serious questions raised about this narrative. Every responsible news organization I've seen, including ones that aren't always responsible on this topic, have said they can't verify either story. And yet this morning, for example, as we speak on Thursday, I see tweet after tweet, social media post after social media post from Democratic congressmen and news commentators and everything. Now that it's been proven that the Palestinians did that to themselves. The monsters who have blamed Israel should be ashamed of themselves. So I set the context with this. First of all, it hasn't been proven. So they're getting ahead of it themselves on this. And secondly, according to the World Health Organization, I looked it up, there have been at least 150 attacks on healthcare and healthcare facilities in Palestine by Israeli forces since October 7th. At least 20 hospitals in Gaza City and North Gaza and one in Rafah have received repeated evacuation orders, even though many of their patients can't be evacuated. 77 attacks also documented in the West Bank, 43 of which caused physical violence to healthcare teams and workers. So whatever happens, whatever is proven about this one bombing, it seems to me that it's suddenly become the test case for whether it's fair to accuse Israel of attacking civilians and specifically health workers when there's overwhelming evidence that it has, including previously firing on that hospital. Am I wrong about any of that?
No, absolutely not. I mean, here again, we have the repeated behavior of erasing past violence, right? We know what has happened since October 7th. We also know what has happened for the last 75 years. Okay, Israel is a violent country. Israel is an oppressive country. Israel is an apartheid country. And Israel continues to inflict massive violence on the Palestinians. And even if, say, Israel wasn't responsible, which obviously it was responsible. I mean, I'm sure the evidence will, come to that conclusion, right? It doesn't, what about the other deaths that Israel has caused, right? It's not as if we need to stop at the hospital. It's not like that's the last thing that Israel bombed, right? Israel continues to bomb and inflict violence on Gaza. So getting stuck on that is just a way of detracting from the rest of the violence that continues to happen and the rest of the violence that already happened. So, I mean, it's as if, Israel doesn't have a track record and all of a sudden it's being accused of doing this thing, right? All of a sudden that Israel bombed a hospital, right? Like, well, Israel would never do that. Israel would do that. Israel does do that, right? It has a track record. And it's really absurd that the narratives continue. I mean, and Israeli official admitted it, right? So, I mean, it's just deplorable that this is happening. And, that's just going to create a narrative space that's bombarded by accusations of whether or not Israel, Hamas, et cetera, a narrative space in which we're then not going to be able to move on to, well, Israel is still inflicting violence. And what are we going to do about it? And, now that I brought this up, Biden just said the Biden administration is now going to send $100 million of humanitarian aid to Gaza, right? How is that even logical? This is so nonsensical. You send Israel weapons that are designed to destroy Gaza and Palestinian lives. And then you, in turn, days later, provide humanitarian aid. That is so violent. And that really disguises and whitewashes and evades and allows Israel to be off the hook for what it has done, the violence that it has inflicted on Palestinians. And the fact that the United States continues to participate in this violence is atrocious. It's unconscionable. And honestly, I don't even know how, on a personal level, I even relate to being American. I am an American, right? I'm also Arab. I pay taxes. My taxes are going to fund this violence. I'm Arab and Muslim, right? And it's very hard to contend with. And I'll just end it there. But, on a personal level, it's just very, very, very disturbing.
And one of the things, I find it very disturbing too. And, I wrote my senators and congressmen, including, my representative is a liberal icon, quote unquote, telling him I wanted him to sign on to the ceasefire now resolution. And I got a form letter back. The first two paragraphs were about the horrors of the Hamas violence, which I don't deny, by the way, but I think we should talk a little bit, if you would, Maha, about structural violence too, because I think that's an unspoken part of these narratives, whether it's racial here in the United States. I mean, back in 1968, Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael said a black family gets evicted from their home. You see it on the news. A black child dies of inadequate medical treatment. You never hear about it. In Gaza, there are 24 deaths per 1,000 live births. That's 10 times more or less, than the equivalent rate just across the fence in Israel. 1/4 of children under 5 years of age suffer from anemia, and more than 1/3 are at risk of not meeting their full developmental potential due to poverty, poor nutrition, lack of access to basic services, stress, and exposure to violence. 80% of Gaza children show symptoms of severe emotional depression or distress. And I bring this up because we never seem to, that rarely gets included in the narrative. Maybe it's a think piece somewhere on page B7 of the New York Times or something, but it never gets emphasized. I don't get as we tell ourselves what we're doing to ourselves and each other and others, I don't get why we leave out, as if those deaths somehow, as if a child who dies from the blockade against Gaza is less of an innocent than a child who dies in every other reason. Shouldn't we be restructuring our narratives to take that into consideration as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's what Palestinians have been doing. That's what allies have been doing, right? That's what, Arabs and Muslims have been doing. But of course, the narrative infrastructure that is working against these challenges is massive. And it's designed to dehumanize Palestinians. It's designed to negate the violence of the state. And we already have this conception, right? When we grow up, not everyone has the same understanding of what the state is. What is the government, right? Is its violence legitimate? And, in the United States, we see this all the time, right? When police kill a Black person, there's never a question about how is that legitimate. It then becomes about dehumanizing the Black person who was killed, as if being killed wasn't violence enough. And this is what you're saying is absolutely one of the biggest problems, is that there's systemic structural violence that is being removed from the equation, such that it's as if two non-state actors are fighting each other. Even when you say Israel's war, Israel-Hamas war, it's not an Israel-Hamas war. It is Israel's war against the Palestinians. If it was just Hamas, it wouldn't have inflicted this much violence. It wouldn't have inflicted this much destruction. And so it's really important, right, what you're saying and what I've been saying, what I've been writing about, right, to really critique the narrative. And, one thing that came to my mind is I saw on Instagram a statement from Representative Barbara Lee, along with Pramila Jayapal, Greg Cesar, James McGovern, Joaquin Castro, Veronica Escobar, Jesus Garcia. And it's talking about the ceasefire. And in one part of the statement, it says, "Let us be clear. Our call for a ceasefire should not be mistaken as a lack of support for the protection of the people of Israel." What is the ceasefire for?
Right.
It's to prevent more Palestinian murders. And still, it becomes about Israel. Israel is not facing the level of violence that Palestinians are. And Palestinians do not have an infrastructure that massive to defend and fight for them.
And I will give you one more, Maha, if I may, which because I've been writing about this a lot, so I have it at hand, or at least in memory, that the top diplomat at the EU, in calling for a ceasefire, which was the right thing to do, felt morally obligated to say, this is Josep Borrell Fonteles, and I quote, "Not all the Palestinian people are terrorists. Now we're talking about Gaza, where half the population are children. I think 40% are under 15 years of age or something. So, and yet, even in trying to do the right thing, the narrative is such that he felt it necessary to say not all of them were, maybe most of them, but, you know, I guess maybe the toddlers, some of the toddlers are innocent. The idea that, you know, and I'm sure that, you know, I know the Representative Tlaib and other people, I mean, she's Palestinian, right? You know, I'm sure their hearts are in the right place. But the fact that these things have to be said at all, even in the pursuit of worthy goals, strikes me as indicative of something very sick in our national perception. I don't know. What do you think about that before we go?
I mean, first of all, when you say that most Palestinians are not terrorists, you're infusing the idea that Palestinians are terrorists. You're reiterating that idea. You're not negating it. And second of all, Israel continuously harms Palestinian children. It treats everyone like a terrorist, right? Palestinian children are detained, right? Palestinian children are harassed. Palestinian children are killed. So everyone is treated like a terrorist. And, you know, one thing I've observed in the larger narrative is, you know, when we talk about the US's violence in the course of the war on terror, there's often the use of the term collateral damage, right? Which is a very disgusting and insensitive term to minimize civilian deaths, right? And civilian murders, right? But that term, unfortunately, is like a step up from what's happening to Palestinians. There isn't even the idea of collateral damage, which means the unintentional killing of civilians, which means it's the intentional killing of civilians that Israel is constantly, right, engaging in. And again, when you use the terrorist narrative, anytime you infuse the narrative, right? You know, I saw this poster once by an organization that was a Muslim. They had a little young Black girl who looked about 10 years old holding a Quran. And the poster said, "Dear God, tell them I'm not a terrorist." Well, now you just told everyone that she was a terrorist. And now you just put that idea into everyone's head. Because instead of just seeing her as a young girl reading a book, right? Now you introduced the idea that she could be a terrorist.
And I would say that you've also told more than 1 billion Muslims worldwide you value their lives less than those of other people. Is that a fair statement in your view?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's the whole war on terror, right? And the fact that the United States doesn't even mention, right, the fact that its war has been primarily and disproportionately against Muslim civilians. And, you know, now that you brought that up, I hope it's okay to just mention quickly, right? The story of the young Muslim Palestinian child, 6 years old, who was stabbed 26 times and his mom stabbed 12 times in Illinois by their landlord, expressly because of their identity as Palestinian and Muslim. And in response, President Biden had the audacity to say, no one should be targeted because of who they are or what religion they practice, even though all of his rhetoric in the last 10 days has been acutely about demonizing Palestinians, demonizing Arabs, demonizing Muslims. And by releasing such a statement, that is, to me, more violent than having stayed quiet. Because then you are acting like you had no responsibility in what happened. And you are negating all of the rhetoric and narrative that you contributed to that made those murders possible.
I think that's perfectly relevant. I'm glad you brought it up. Well, Dr. Maha, Hilal, there's a lot to deal with right now, but I think, you know, one of the ways, and I know this is difficult for a lot of us to experience, and one of the ways I think to survive it and maybe make some progress in the situation is by sorting out the stories around us and clarifying it, because I think a lot of people are in pain and also in a cloud of confusion that intensifies the pain. So, you know, my wish for this conversation, my goal that I think has been fulfilled, is to clarify that a little bit. So I thank you for that. and for all your good work. Again, my guest is Dr. Maha Hilal of the Muslim Counterpublics Lab. Thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you so much, Richard, for having me.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.